southern border. So let's take a look at how these stories are being reported on and what's being discussed in the global media. So the front page of the Financial Times picks out the fact that Christine Lagarde has got the backing for the job at the European Central Bank as the EU hands out some of the most important jobs. So more detail on that and also on Ursula von der Leyen. The Guardian reports that parents are discouraging their children from learning foreign languages, saying it won't be necessary after Brexit. We'll talk about that as well. We've heard your views on that story. BBC News website and app has more on the Nike racism row, saying the company's now lost funding for having backed down to its critics. Vice News pulls together an investigation carried out by various media outlets which found people crossing the border into China are having malware installed on their phones by customs officials. And then finally, an amazing study in The Eye. It shows how team games can be played by telepathy. Well, Nina Traitman is back, as promised, from the Wall Street Journal. Nina, let's talk some more then about these positions that have been agreed on. It's not a done deal just yet, but for the new roles within the European Commission, the Financial Times talks about a 3-day gruelling summit where they tried to whittle down who they believe should have these key roles. It's highlighted, of course, Christine Lagarde and Ursula von der Leyen. It wasn't an easy task to get these final names, was it?
Yeah, no, I guess it was far from easy. And we saw on Monday and a few days before that there was actually not really agreement amongst EU leaders who they would want to nominate. Given, of course, in the end, the EU is not really at an easy state at the moment, given that there's disagreement about where the union should go. So I guess it was expected that this wouldn't be an easy task. Interestingly enough, of course, you've also seen this movement from the European Parliament to say that, to nominate their own candidates, the so-called Spitzenkandidaten, which EU leaders yesterday sort of like overlooked by nominating Mrs. von der Leyen as head of the European Commission, or candidate for the head of the European Commission, which is something which still needs to be approved by Parliament. So we'll see whether that goes through.
Indeed, and that's what the Financial Times highlights. It says although there was near unanimous support in the end for these various nominations, the European Parliament, they still see, there will be resistance within the European Parliament. So it's not necessarily a smooth path at this point.
No, and of course it's also an interesting development given that well, we've seen the European Parliament sort of like trying to find its role in the past couple of years and like becoming a stronger power in this lot of sort of like set of institutions that is governing the European Union. And I guess it won't be an easy one for Mrs. von der Leyen to get approval from Parliament, even though one of the candidates that the Parliament had suggested, Mr. Weber, has already pulled back and said that his time as a candidate is over. So maybe that eases the transition for Mrs. von der Leyen.
For Christine Lagarde, of course, the current boss of the International Monetary Fund, moving to the European Central Bank if again her nomination is agreed upon. I mean, I wasn't surprised to hear about that. The FT says that Christine Lagarde's selection to replace Mario Draghi was unexpected, but given her track record, I actually wasn't surprised.
Well, I guess she's been a fixture in like the world of global finance since her time as French finance minister and then also as head of the IMF. I guess the papers have pointed out that she doesn't have a central banking experience so far. So Mr. Draghi and also previous leaders of the European Central Bank have all been national heads of their central banks before they got the post.
And the other thing as well, we must remember that Christine Lagarde was right in the middle of all those negotiations with the European Central Bank and with the European Union when it came to the bailout of Portugal, Greece, Ireland, in the middle of the Eurozone debt crisis. I mean, she had to sort of work through all of that with Angela Merkel, with various other leaders.
Which is, I guess, why, for example, Mrs. Merkel has been saying yesterday, well, if you can run the IMF, you can also run the ECB. We'll see.
We shall see. Yeah. All right, let's move on. Now, I'd really love to hear your take on this, because it's really interesting, actually. Despite the fact that, the UK is leaving the European Union, that the language spoken at all meetings in the European Union, European Council, etc., Commission will be the English language, won't it? because that is the language. It's then translated into other languages. But this article about the British Council has found, it's put a report out there to show that the uptake of languages now in options where children decide on their options for GCSEs, etc., languages is falling quite dramatically. And among some reports, it suggests that actually parents are saying, well, actually there isn't the need to learn another language now is not so great. Now we're moving out of the European Union.
Yeah, I find it interesting because, of course, it comes on the back of language learning being less, I find, of a priority here in the UK than, for example, in continental Europe and Germany, where I went to school, where it was sort of like mandatory to learn not just English, but also then a second language, which in my case was French. Of course, you can debate whether that's really useful or not. I went to live in China and learned Chinese, or some Chinese. So I guess the fact that you're learning a language is beneficial, independent of whether you can use that language for work and for business afterwards.
I mean, culturally, in the UK, I know, you tell me, we assume that those who live in Europe and other countries just think we're really lazy, because quite often when we travel overseas, we don't often try to speak a foreign language or what have you. Is that your opinion? Is that the view?
I guess to some degree.
She's on BBC News.
The thing is, of course, that everybody's in Europe speaks English, so of course you get by, and I guess that's the problem. Like, unless you're faced with a situation that you're in a country where you can't communicate because people don't speak English, you're not really understanding this real need to learn a foreign language.
Well, let's get the views of our viewers who watch the briefing. So Thomas Snedden says studying a foreign language is somewhat pointless unless you live in a country where you can use it daily. I studied French for years in grade school. I was devastated when I went to France for the first time. I couldn't understand or make a simple conversation. We've got other views. One opinion is actually that this story is completely misleading. This is the view of Ian Calvert, because he says actually learning languages in the UK has been declining for something like 20 years. It's not necessarily
a new thing,
because of Brexit. Culturally, as you say, because English is spoken as a second language in so many countries, the need for us to learn another language is not as great as perhaps it would be in your case. Yeah. But as you say, when you grew up, it was seen as a given that you had to learn at least a second language at school.
Yeah, I guess it's also like in the end changing a bit of your mindset and your outlook on the world. Like, I think I wouldn't be in this place where I am now, working for an American newspaper, being a German in the UK, if I hadn't been encouraged to learn languages
and
before.
Soon moving to New York to work for Wall Street Journal in New York. All right, let's have a look at this story about Nike. This is BBC Online. Nike loses factory aid as racist trainer row intensifies. Michelle Fleury unpacked this for us earlier. This is about the use of the flag on these sneakers, they would call them in the US, that are coming out for the 4th of July. It's like a special pair of trainers. What's going on?
Well, it seems that Nike decided that the choice of this particular flag, which is a historic US flag,
it's got one less star,
wasn't the right choice after criticism from Colin Kaepernick, who is a Nike-sponsored sportsman. Interestingly enough, we saw this turned in yesterday from the governor of Arizona, actually criticizing Nike for making that decision to pull the product, saying that political correctness isn't really appreciated. I guess just underlines how difficult it is for companies these days to...
Apparently anybody who's got a pair of these sneakers that have been, that have been pulled back by Nike, anyone who got hold of a pair, they can sell them now on eBay for like $2,000.
Yes.
They're making a fortune. All right, let's swiftly move on because we're sort of running out of time. So this story was really interesting in the Vice about China forcing tourists to install text-stealing malware at the border. It sends a bit of a shiver down the spine. What's the details?
Well, based on this report, people traveling into China, especially into the Xinjiang province in western China, had a program installed into their phones by border officers looking at texts, contacts, and also then at any files that they had on their phones. It's interesting, of course, because it comes at a time when Chinese authorities are cracking down on the Muslim population in Xinjiang. We saw reports last year, according to which there were more than 1 million people in detention centers. I find it interesting that they're now, what seems to be that as if Chinese authorities are now going after foreigners as well, because in the end, Xinjiang is not really a very frequently traveled region within China. It's not the place to go for foreign tourists if you went to China. So I guess just illustrates how much of a concern this region seems to be from a Chinese perspective. And also, of course, human rights watchers have criticized this move as another sign of China just going too far in its treatment of the area.
Of people. We're going to not talk about this telepathy story, so I'm going to tweet it to those of you who are really interested in this one.
Don't get to
because
it.
Nina, you're moving to New York. What is going on? You're going to work for the Wall Street Journal in New York, is that right?
Yes, starting on the 23rd of July and continuing to cover corporate finance, but then for American companies.
So you will come on the briefing when you're in London, I hope. When
yes,
you're here on holiday,
yes.
You'll get up really early and join us on the programme. Recently married, and just to mention as well that you and your husband do these crazy double marathons on a regular basis.
Well, on a
marathon one day and a marathon the next day.
Yes.
Bionic. Thanks,
Thank
Nina.
you.
It's been great to have you with us on the briefing on a regular basis. I hope you'll come back. We will see you again, I'm sure. Thank you too for your company. Have a really, really good day, and I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.